I worked the night shift at a truck stop for 9 months. I want to be upfront about that because some of what I'm going to tell you might be hard to believe, and I figure if you understand where I was in my life at the time, why I was working that job, why I stayed as long as I did, why I didn't just quit the first time something felt wrong, it'll make more sense. Not complete sense. Nothing about this story makes complete sense, even now, 3 years later. But more sense. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, went to community college for 2 years, dropped out, worked a string of jobs that I'm not going to bore you with. By the time I was 27, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment in a small town called Carver's Mill, which sits right off Interstate 40 in western Tennessee, not far from the Arkansas border. Population maybe 4,000, give or take. The kind of town that exists primarily because a highway runs through it. The truck stop was called Trails End. Still is, I suppose, though I haven't been back. It sat right off exit 212, a massive sprawling complex. Fuel islands for 18-wheelers, a diner that was open 24 hours, a convenience store, a trucker's lounge with showers and a TV room, and a small motel out back with 12 rooms. The whole operation ran around the clock because the highway never stopped. There were always trucks pulling in, always drivers needing fuel or food or a few hours of sleep in a parking lot. I got the job because I needed money, and the hiring manager, a tired woman named Brenda, told me the night shift paid $1.50 more per hour than days, and I did not ask any follow-up questions. I should have. The hours were 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 days a week. I ran the register, stocked shelves, did a walkthrough of the property every 2 hours, and helped the night cook, a quiet man named Phil, with closing duties in the diner around 4 a.m. Simple job, boring job. The kind of job where you spend a lot of time staring at the parking lot through plate glass windows wondering about your life. The first 6 weeks were completely uneventful. Then the man in the gray car started coming. He came in the first time on a Thursday around 2 in the morning. I remember it because Thursdays were always slow. The big trucking rush was Monday through Wednesday, and by Thursday night the lot was usually half empty and it felt like you were working in an aquarium, all that quiet glass and fluorescent light and nothing moving outside. He drove a gray 4-door sedan, older model, American-made. I couldn't tell you the exact year. No front license plate, which I noticed but didn't think much about. Arkansas didn't require front plates, and a lot of people coming off I-40 were Arkansas plates. He parked at the far end of the lot, away from the other vehicles, in a spot that was technically a parking space but not one anyone ever used because it was half in shadow, just past the last of the overhead lights. He came inside and went straight to the beverage coolers in the back. Stood there for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, which is a long time to stand in front of a cooler, and then came to the register with a single bottle of water. Paid cash. Exact change. I said something like long night or rough drive, the way you do when you're bored at 2 a.m. and another human being walks through the door. He looked at me. I don't know how to describe his eyes exactly. They weren't threatening. They weren't crazy. They were just empty, the way a house looks when nobody's lived in it for a while. All the lights off, curtains drawn, nothing moving behind the glass. He said something like that, and he left. I watched him walk to his car. He didn't get in right away. He stood next to it in that half shadow at the edge of the lot and looked back at the building. Not at me specifically, just at the building, for maybe 30 seconds. Then he got in and drove back out to the highway. I thought nothing of it. Weird guy. Truck stops attract weird guys. It's practically a job requirement. He came back the following Thursday. Same time, 2 in the morning, give or take. Same gray car, same far corner spot. Same routine, straight to the coolers, long pause, single bottle of water, exact cash. This time I didn't say anything. Something about him made small talk feel wrong, like trying to have a conversation through a window that doesn't open. He left without speaking, stood outside by his car for a while, looking at the building, then drove away. The Thursday after that, same thing. By the 4th Thursday, I mentioned it to Phil, the night cook. We were in the diner at 4 a.m., Phil doing his cleaning routine, me eating a free plate of eggs I wasn't technically supposed to have, but Phil had never once cared about. I described the man, gray car, far corner spot, 1 water, cash, and Phil stopped wiping down the counter and looked at me. He asked what the man looked like. I said average. Medium height, medium build, maybe 40 or 45. Brown hair going gray at the temples. Plain face, forgettable face, the kind of face you'd walk past in a grocery store without registering. Phil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long's he been coming?" I said 4 weeks, every Thursday, around 2. Phil nodded slowly, went back to cleaning. I asked if he knew who it was. He said no, but the way he said it, not looking at me, not elaborating, just that one flat word, told me he knew something. Phil was not an elaborate man. He communicated primarily in grunts and nods and the occasional complete sentence, and I'd learned to read the difference between his "no, I don't know" and his "no, I don't want to talk about it." That was the second one. I let it go. Should not have let it go. The 5th Thursday was the night things started to shift. It was late February. Cold, clear, the parking lot empty except for 3 semi-trucks running their engines on the far side of the fuel islands. 2 in the morning came and went and the gray car didn't appear, and I told myself good. Maybe he'd found a different truck stop, and I went back to stocking the cigarette rack behind the register. At 2:43 he pulled in. Later than usual. He went through his routine cooler, water, register, and this time when he paid he paused. His hand with the coins in it hovered over the counter for a moment, and he looked at me. He said, "You been working here long?" I said, "Since October." He said, "You like it?" I said it paid the bills. He nodded, put the coins on the counter, picked up his water, and then he turned back, already halfway to the door, and said, "You're the 3rd one they've had on nights since August." I asked what happened to the other 2. He looked at me for a long second, and then he said, "That's a good question," and left. I watched him in the lot. He didn't stand by his car this time, just got in, sat for a moment, and drove away. I went to the back and found Brenda's onboarding paperwork. I still had it in my locker. I keep everything, and I looked at the hire date, October 3rd, my first day. I thought about what the man had said. 3rd one since August. That was a 2-month stretch, August to October. 2 night shift employees in 2 months before me. I'd never thought to ask why the position was open. The next morning, end of my shift, 7 a.m., gray light coming in through the windows. I waited for Brenda to come in for the day shift handover. She was always there by 7:15. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, what happened to the people who'd had the night shift before me. She didn't even look up from her clipboard. She said the first one had quit, personal reasons. She didn't know the details. The second one had transferred to a location in Memphis. She said it matter-of-factly. No hesitation. No, wait. I said that seemed like a lot of turnover for a 2-month stretch. She said the night shift had high turnover. Always had. People didn't like the hours. I went home and slept and told myself that was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and mostly believed it. Here's something I should tell you about Trails End, because it matters later. The property was bigger than it looked from the highway. The motel out back, 12 rooms in a single-story L-shape, was technically a separate business, owned by a man named Gerald Lott who'd had a deal with the truck stop for 30 years. Gerald was 70-something, mostly retired, and the motel more or less ran itself. A woman named Delia handled check-ins during the day. At night, if someone needed a room, they came to me. I had a lockbox with spare keycards and a rate sheet taped to the inside of the register cabinet. The motel stayed maybe 30% occupied on a good week. Long-haul truckers mostly, people who needed to sleep somewhere that wasn't a cab. Occasionally families on road trips who'd planned badly. Once in a while someone would come in and pay for a week at a time, cash, and I'd never see them except maybe a silhouette moving behind the curtain. The rooms were numbered 1 through 12. Rooms 1 through 6 faced the parking lot. Rooms 7 through 12 faced the back, which was just a chain-link fence, a field of dead grass, and the tree line about 100 yards out. Room 10 had been vacant since I started working there. I knew this because the key for room 10 was always in the lockbox. Every other room turned over, keys out, keys back, guests coming and going. Room 10 never moved. I assumed it was being renovated or had a problem, busted HVAC, leaked something, and never asked. I would like very much to go back in time and ask. March came in cold and wet. The man in the gray car kept coming every Thursday, like clockwork. He never said anything else interesting, just the water, the exact change, the long look at the building from the parking lot. I'd started to think of him as a fixed feature of the shift, like the broken ice machine by the trucker's lounge or the ceiling tile in aisle 3 that had a water stain shaped like a dog. But I kept thinking about what he'd said. Third one since August. That's a good question. I started paying more attention. The thing about a night shift at a highway truck stop is that you see a lot of people, and most of them are in transit, passing through, stopping briefly, moving on. The long-haul truckers were the regulars. Same faces cycling through every week or two, depending on their routes. I got to know some of them by name. Big Carl, who drove a refrigerated produce hauler and always bought 6 candy bars and a large coffee. Diane, who ran a flatbed and was the most efficient human being I'd ever encountered. In-fueled coffee, back on the road in under 12 minutes, every time. Old Wendell, who'd been driving since before I was born and sat in the diner for an hour every time he came through, eating pie and reading a paperback. One night in mid-March, old Wendell came in around 3 a.m. and sat in his usual booth, and I brought him coffee the way I sometimes did when it was slow and I felt like a conversation. We talked about his route for a while. He was running east to west that week, Memphis to Amarillo, and then there was a comfortable silence, and then I asked him how long he'd been coming to Trail's End. He said probably 20 years, give or take. I said the place must have changed a lot. He said some things not. Got quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. I said I'd heard there was some turnover on the night shift lately. 2 people in 2 months before me. Old Wendell looked up. He asked how I heard that. I told him about the man in the gray car. Wendell was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Not drinking, just turning it. And then he said, "Don't let anybody put you in room 10. I said nobody had. He said, "Make sure it stays that way." I asked him why. He took a long drink of his coffee, set it down, looked at me with that particular kind of patience old men sometimes have, the kind that comes from a life of knowing things they can't explain cleanly. He said, "The 2 before you know why they really left?" I said I'd heard personal reasons and a transfer. He shook his head, slowly, the way you shake your head when you hear an explanation you know isn't the real one. He said, "The kid before you, young, 20 or so, I don't remember his name. I was here one night, maybe 2 weeks before he stopped working here. Around 4 in the morning. I'm sitting right where I'm sitting now. And he comes out of the back room white as a sheet. I mean white. I thought he was going to pass out. I asked what happened. Wendell said, I asked him the same thing. He told me he'd seen someone going into room 10. He'd gone out to check, make sure it was a real guest since nobody had checked in. And when he got to the room, the door was shut and there was a light on inside. He knocked. No answer. He went and got the spare key, opened the door. Wendell paused. And, I said, room was empty. No one there. Bed made. But the TV was on. And the shower was running. I felt something cold move up my back. Not dramatic, not movie scary. Just a quiet chill. The way a room feels when a window you didn't know was open has been letting the cold in for a while. I said maybe someone had gotten the wrong room, checked into 10 by mistake and then left. Wendell said, that's what I figured. But the kid, he said the shower running wasn't the thing that bothered him. He said the thing that bothered him was what was in the shower. I asked what that was. Wendell finished his coffee. He said there were clothes in there, just sitting on the floor of the shower, soaking wet. Men's clothes, like someone had taken them off in the shower and walked out without putting anything back on. He put money on the table for the coffee the way he always did. He quit 2 days later. Now, I'm not telling you that's why. Could have been anything. People quit jobs. He stood up. Just stay out of room 10. He left, and I stood there in the empty diner at 3:30 in the morning with the fluorescent lights buzzing and the parking lot quiet and outside. In the far corner of the lot, the gray car was parked where it always was. I hadn't heard it pull in. I started keeping a notebook. I don't know exactly why. I'd never kept a diary or a journal or anything like that. But something about the way information was coming to me in pieces, disconnected and indirect, made me want to write it down. Like if I had it on paper, I could look at it all at once and maybe it would form a shape. What I had by late March. 1. A man came in every Thursday at 2 a.m., paid cash, bought one water, said as little as possible. He told me I was the third night shift employee since August, and when I asked what happened to the other two, he called it a good question. Old Wendell had implied the official explanations for why those two left were not the real reasons. The one immediately before me had apparently been spooked badly enough to quit 2 days after whatever he'd seen. 3. Room 10 was always vacant. Had been vacant the entire time I'd worked there. 4. Phil, the night cook, had reacted with something. Not exactly fear, but recognition, when I described the man in the gray car. I tried to think of an explanation that tied all 4 of those things together and made sense, and I could not do it. What I could do was pay more attention to Room 10. Nothing happened with Room 10 for 3 weeks after my conversation with Wendell. It just sat there, dark, still, key in the lockbox. I found myself doing what I should not have done, letting it become a thing I thought about. Every 2-hour walkthrough of the property, I'd come around the backside of the motel and slow down when I passed 10's door. I told myself I was just being observant. I wasn't. I was fixating, and fixating on something at 3 in the morning in an empty parking lot is not a thing I recommend. The night it changed was a Wednesday, not Thursday. I noted that specifically because I'd started to think of strange things happening on Thursdays. Wednesdays felt safer somehow. This was April 4th, around 2:30 a.m. I was doing my walkthrough, full lap of the property, fuel islands, parking lot, diner perimeter, around the back of the motel, back to the store. It was a clear night, cold but dry, and the half moon was up and gave just enough light to see by without the overhead lamps. I came around the corner of the motel, heading along the backside where rooms 7 through 12 faced the field, and I stopped. The light was on in room 10. Not just on, the curtains were drawn, but I could see the edge of light around them, that thin yellow line at the top and bottom and one side that tells you a room is occupied. And I could hear the TV, faint, through the door, but unmistakable, the particular murmur of a television set. I stood there for a long moment. My first thought was, someone checked in. Simple, logical. Delia handles check-ins in the day, but sometimes when I came on shift, Brenda would leave me a note. Room 4, late arrival expected, here's the key card. Maybe someone had pre-booked room 10 and Brenda had forgotten to tell me. My second thought, the key for room 10 is in the lockbox. I'd been the only one with access to the lockbox since 11. I hadn't taken the key out. I was certain of this. I went back to the store, opened the register cabinet, opened the lockbox. The key for room 10 was gone. I stood there with the lockbox open for a good 30 seconds. Then I closed it, went back outside, and walked to room 10's door, stood in front of it. From inside, I could hear the TV more clearly now. A commercial, something cheerful and bright sounding, and underneath it, barely audible, something else. Running water. I knocked. The TV kept going. The water kept running. I knocked again, louder. Nothing. I had a master key card in my shirt pocket, works on all rooms for emergencies, kept on me during the walkthrough. My hand was on it. I stood there in the cold and thought about what Wendell had told me and what the kid before me had found, and I thought, you can open this door, or you can go call Brenda, or you can pretend you didn't see anything and finish your walkthrough. I stood there for probably 2 full minutes. Then I turned around and went back inside. I called Phil. Phil was in the diner doing his prep work for the early morning rush. He came in at midnight, same as me, cooked until about 8, and the 4 a.m. cleanup was just part of his routine. I went through the connecting door between the store and the diner and found him at the grill and told him what I'd seen. He listened without turning around, kept working the grill. When I finished, he said, "Did you open it?" I said no. He said, "Good." I asked him what he knew about room 10. He put his spatula down, turned around. Phil was a big man, 6 foot something, broad, the kind of person who looked like he'd been built for moving heavy things. He had a face that defaulted to neutral and only rarely showed much of anything. Right then, it showed something I hadn't seen on him before. Not fear exactly. More like the look you get when you've been ignoring a problem for a long time and someone finally asks you directly about it. He said, "I've worked nights here for 11 years. I said I didn't know that. He said, "Room 10 does that about once a month." Maybe once every 6 weeks. Light goes on, TV goes on, shower runs. Nobody checks in. Nobody checks out. In the morning, Delia opens it up. No key missing. Room undisturbed. Bed made. Dry. I asked if he'd ever told Gerald Lott, the motel owner. Phil made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He said, "Gerald knows." I asked what Gerald said about it. Phil said, "Gerald says his father built that room in 1973, and he's never had a complaint from a paying guest. He says what happens in there when nobody's booked it is not his business." I stood there trying to absorb that. Phil turned back to the grill. He said, "Go finish your walkthrough. Don't go in room 10. I did not sleep well after that shift. I went home at 7, tried to sleep until 2 p.m. the way I usually did, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling and going through it all. The missing key, the water running. Gerald knows. I thought about calling someone. Who would I call? Brenda? She'd tell me people had overactive imaginations on the night shift and to get some rest. Gerald Lott? Phil had just told me Gerald knew and didn't care. The police? And tell them what, that a motel room had a ghost? I'd worked at a truck stop long enough to know how that conversation ended. I thought about quitting. I thought about it seriously, lying there in my apartment in the afternoon light, and I worked out that if I quit I'd have about 6 weeks before my savings ran out. I didn't have another job lined up. The next nearest full-time overnight gig was 45 minutes away and didn't pay nearly as well. I thought about the 2 people who'd had my job before me, whether they'd had the same conversation with themselves, whether they'd made the same math calculation and whether the math had looked the same to them. I thought about old Wendell's face when he'd said, "Don't let anybody put you in room 10. Not don't go in room 10. Don't let anybody put you there." I stayed. God help me, I stayed. April moved slowly. I kept the notebook. I wrote down everything I could remember and dated it carefully. The man in the gray car kept coming on Thursdays. I started paying closer attention to him, writing down what he did, what he said, which was almost nothing, how long he spent in the parking lot before and after his purchase. It was usually the same. The only variation was sometimes he'd be there when I did my 2 a.m. walkthrough, just standing by his car, and when I came back around the building he'd still be there, not doing anything, just standing in the dark at the edge of the light, looking at the property. On the first Thursday in April, I did something I hadn't done before. When he came in, I kept the conversation going as long as I could. Asked him where he was coming from, where he was headed. He said he wasn't coming from or going to anywhere in particular. I said that was an interesting answer. He said, "I drive sometimes when I can't sleep." I asked how often he couldn't sleep. He said, "Most nights." I asked how long he'd been doing this, driving out here at 2 in the morning. He looked at me, that empty house look. He said, "Long enough to see a few of you come and go." I said, "What do you mean by that?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the register, then back at me. He said, "You're the first one who's lasted more than 2 months." I felt my throat tighten. I said, "What happened to the others?" He said, "They got scared, quit, or transferred, that's what they'll tell you. But the second one asked to be moved after something happened out here." I asked what had happened. He picked up his water. For a second, I thought he was going to walk out without answering, the way he usually did. But he paused. He said, "The second one, the one who transferred, she came out of the motel one night when she was doing her walkthrough, running. And I was sitting in my car and I watched her run across the parking lot and go inside, and she never came back out for the rest of the shift." I asked what she'd been running from. He said, "I couldn't see. Whatever was behind the motel." He left. I sat at the register with my notebook on my lap and my pen hovering over the page, and I thought, whatever was behind the motel, the backside, rooms 7 through 12, room 10. I wrote it down. May. Warm now, the parking lot damp after evening storms. The smell of diesel and honeysuckle that I associated with trails end at this point, probably forever. The shifts had gotten a little easier in their rhythms. I knew every regular, knew every quirk of the building, knew which fluorescent tube in the cooler section buzzed louder than the others and which back door stuck when it rained. But I'd started to feel watched. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it's easy to retroactively turn a general unease into something more specific than it was. I wasn't seeing things. I wasn't hearing voices. It was just a sensation. The particular feeling of being in a space and sensing that the space contains more than you can account for. Like when you're in a room and you feel a draft and you look for the open window and can't find it. It happened mostly during my walkthroughs. In the parking lot, moving between the fuel islands, rounding the back of the motel. The feeling was strongest at the back of the motel. I started timing my walkthroughs. Shortest time I could do the full route without technically skipping anything was 11 minutes. I got it down to 12 minutes flat, moving quickly, not lingering. On a Wednesday night in early May, another Wednesday, not a Thursday, I was doing my midnight walkthrough, first one of the shift. I came around the back of the motel and I stopped. There was a man standing in the field, not close, maybe 60, 70 yards out, between the motel and the tree line, just standing there in the dark, facing the motel. I couldn't make out any features. It was dark. There were no lights on that side of the property, and the moon wasn't up yet, just a shape, a man-shaped shadow in a field at midnight. I stood very still. The shape didn't move. For maybe 30 seconds, we were both just frozen. Me at the back corner of the motel, him out in the field, neither of us doing anything. Then a cloud moved and a little more moonlight came through and I could see slightly better, and what I saw was nothing. The field was empty, no one there. I stood there for another minute scanning, nothing moving, just dead grass and the tree line and the night sky. I finished my walkthrough. I didn't run. I walked the rest of the route at my usual pace, went back inside, and wrote down what I'd seen or thought I'd seen in my notebook. I did not call Phil this time. I didn't tell anyone. Here is something I've thought about a lot since, trying to understand it. In the weeks that followed that night, I started noticing things I could not explain cleanly. Small things. The kind of things that, if you described each one individually, would sound like nothing. Coincidences, misremembering, the tricks a tired brain plays at 3 in the morning. But they kept happening. The stack of paper towels in the back room had been moved when I came back from a walkthrough. I was certain I'd left them on the left side of the shelf. They were on the right. Could I have moved them without thinking? Maybe. Probably. A trucker's logbook left on the diner counter at 2 a.m. One of those standard paper logs the older guys still used. Was open to a page I hadn't opened, and there was writing on it that wasn't the trucker's in a different handwriting. Just a line. I still have it in my notebook, the exact words, "You should leave this place." Could have been a prank from Phil. Could have been a trucker messing around. I asked Phil. He said he hadn't touched it. The security camera. Trail's End had 6 exterior security cameras. I'd never paid much attention to them. They fed to a monitor behind the register and a DVR in Brenda's office. On a slow night in mid-May, I started actually watching the feeds. The cameras covered the fuel islands, the main entrance, the front parking lot, the side of the building, and 2 of the 6 motel parking spaces on the front side. No camera covered the back of the motel. I'd never noticed that. 11 months of working there, and I'd never noticed that the one area I'd started to feel most unsettled by was the one area with no camera coverage. I asked Brenda about it the next morning. She said Gerald had never wanted a camera pointed at his motel rooms. Privacy for the guests. I said, what about the back, where there were no rooms, just the field? She looked at me like the question didn't make sense. She said she'd pass it on to Gerald. She never brought it up again. The gray car man told me his name in late May. He said it almost accidentally. I'd asked him a direct question. Do you want to tell me your name? And he'd answered before he seemed to think about it. He said Ray, just the one word. Then he looked slightly annoyed with himself, the way someone does when they've been deliberately vague about something and then slipped. I said, Ray, what do you do for a living? He said, I drove trucks for 20 years. I'm retired. I thought about that. A retired trucker, can't sleep, drives to the same truck stop every Thursday at 2 in the morning, buys 1 water, stands in the parking lot. I said, did you know the people who worked nights here before me? He said, not no. I saw them the way I see you. I said, did either of them ever tell you what scared them? He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said, the first one, the kid, he came out of the motel one night and he was talking to someone I couldn't see. just standing there in the front lot, talking. I thought maybe he had earbuds in phone call, but then he turned and started walking toward the field, out behind the motel. I sat here and watched him walk around the building and disappear. I said, "And?" Ray said, "He came back 20 minutes later, walked back around, went inside. I knocked on the door. I don't usually do that, but something about it, and I asked if he was okay. He said yes. He said someone had asked him to help with something." I said, "Who asked him?" Ray looked at me, that long, flat look. He said, "That's what I asked him." He said he didn't know. He said he'd been talking to someone and then they were gone and he was standing in the field alone. He paused. He said he quit 2 weeks after that. And the girl, the second one, she ran across the parking lot one night and I never found out what she'd seen. She was gone by the end of the month. He picked up his water. He said, "You've lasted longer than either of them. I keep coming back to see if you're still here." I said, "Why do you care?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window at the dark parking lot beyond it. He said, "Because I drove out of here 30 years ago in the middle of my shift and I've never been able to explain what I saw. And every few years someone new takes that job and I keep hoping they'll see it too and tell me what it is. So I know I didn't imagine it." My mouth was very dry. I said, "What did you see?" He looked at me for a long time. He said, "Go look in room 10." And he walked out the door. I need to stop here and tell you something about the kind of person I am, because it matters for what comes next. I am not brave. I want to be clear about that. I am not someone who rushes toward things that frighten him. Everything in my nature was telling me to call Phil or call Brenda or just do nothing. Pretend Ray hadn't said what he'd said. Go back to stocking shelves. I sat at the register for 45 minutes after he left. I thought about the kid who'd gone out to the field to help someone he couldn't see. I thought about the woman who'd run back across the parking lot. I thought about Phil, 11 years on the night shift, knows what room 10 does, actively chooses not to look. I thought about Ray, 30 years, coming back every Thursday, 30 years of not knowing. I thought, I have the master key card in my pocket. At 3:41 in the morning, I got up from the register and walked to the back of the motel. The light was on in room 10. I could see it the moment I came around the corner, that thin yellow line around the curtain, the same as before, and the TV murmuring, and the water. I stopped outside the door. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Nothing. I stood there with the master keycard in my hand. I put it to the reader. The light blinked green. I pushed the door open. The room was lit by the bedside lamp. Not bright, just that warm tungsten glow that makes motel rooms look like photographs. The bed was made, smooth, undisturbed. The TV was on, tuned to a cable news channel with the sound very low, the anchor moving her mouth silently. On the small table by the window, a glass of water, full. No condensation on the outside, like it had just been poured. The shower was running. I could hear it clearly now, the white noise of it, steam coming from under the bathroom door. I stood in the doorway and did not move. The shower stopped, just like that, mid-run. Not the way a shower sounds when it runs out of hot water or the pressure drops, but a deliberate stopping. Someone turning the handle. I heard nothing for about 10 seconds. No movement, no sound. Then the bathroom door opened. He was wearing a white motel towel around his waist. A man, maybe 60 years old, I couldn't be sure. Thin, angular, gray hair wet and flat against his head. He looked at me and he didn't seem startled. He looked at me the way you'd look at a slightly unusual piece of weather, noting it, registering it, not alarmed. He said, "You came." I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm in room 10. I said, "Nobody checked in. The key is missing from the lockbox and nobody checked in." He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient. He said, "Son, I've been checking in and out of this room since 1978. I don't know how long I stood in that doorway. Long enough for the steam from the bathroom to drift out into the room and dissipate. Long enough for the news anchor on the TV to finish one segment and start another. The man, he said his name was Thomas Reed, though I'm not sure why I believed him, went and sat on the edge of the bed, completely composed. He looked like someone who had sat on the edge of this bed many times. He moved through the room with the ease of familiarity. I said, "How is that possible? Since 1978? He said, "I drove trucks, ran the I-40 corridor my whole career. This was my stop. I stayed here probably 100 times. I said, "Stayed here how? You're not." He looked at me. He said, "I know what I'm not. You don't have to say it." I stood there. My hand was still on the door frame. He said, "Gerald's father, the man who built this motel, he was a good man. He let truckers run tabs, let drivers sleep in rooms when they were short on cash, work it off later. I never once paid full price for room 10 because Harold Lott knew I was a regular and he trusted me. That trust doesn't go away just because." He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, "It doesn't go away." I asked him about the key, how the key had gotten out of the lockbox. He said he didn't take the key. He never took the key. He said, "The room knows when I'm coming." I asked if he'd spoken to the previous night shift workers. He said yes. The first one, the kid, had agreed to help him with something, had come out to the field with him. I asked what Thomas had needed help with. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My logbooks are buried in the field, behind the motel. I ran paper logs my whole career, the real kind, before the electronic ones. They're in a metal box I buried out there in 1994. Last time I was here when I was alive. I need them moved, before the construction." I said, "What construction?" He said, "Gerald sold the back parcel to a developer. Ground breaks in September. They'll dig up everything back there. I need those logs moved before that happens." I asked why the logs mattered. He was quiet again. Longer. He said, "Because I wasn't the only one who buried things in that field." I am going to tell you the rest of this as plainly as I can. I know how it sounds. I've had 3 years to think about how it sounds, and it still sounds exactly the way you think it sounds, and I don't have a better framework for it. I am telling you what happened. I didn't help Thomas that night. Couldn't. I stood in the doorway of room 10 and I listened to him and I believed him. That's the strangest thing. I believed him immediately and completely, the way you believe something when it's said to you by someone who has no reason to lie. And then I told him I needed to think about it. He said that was fine. He said he'd be back. I asked when. He said, "Thursday." I told Phil in the morning. I sat across from him in the diner and told him everything, the whole conversation. And Phil listened the way he always listened, without comment, without expression. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He told me the same thing in 2019. I stared at him. He said, "One of the other night guys, before my time, I heard this from Brenda. One of them actually helped him. Moved the box. Thomas came back for it, which is apparently what happens when you complete whatever it is he's asking. But whoever moved it put it somewhere else on the property, and 3 months later the guy quit and took whatever information he had about where with him." I asked why Phil hadn't done it himself. Phil looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Because I don't go in room 10. I never go in room 10. I've kept that rule for 11 years and it's kept me sane." I asked what was in the box, according to Thomas. Phil said he didn't know. He said he'd never asked. I asked what Thomas had meant about not being the only one who'd buried things in the field. Phil said, "I don't know, and I don't want to know, and Marcus, neither do you." Thursday came. I'd spent the days between barely sleeping, turning it all over. I tried to research Thomas Reed, looked up truck driving accident records, obituaries, Tennessee death records accessible online. I found 3 men named Thomas Reed in Tennessee over the past 50 years. One had died in 1997, age 62, in a traffic accident on I-40 near Jackson. I couldn't confirm anything else about him. I told myself I wasn't going to go back to room 10. That Phil was right, that the rule existed for a reason, that getting involved in whatever this was served no rational purpose. Thursday, 2 a.m. The gray car pulled in. Ray came inside, bought his water, paid with exact change. He looked at me. I looked at him. He said, "You went in." I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Because you look like someone who went in." I told him about Thomas, about the logbooks in the field, about the construction coming in September. Ray sat down on the stool at the counter. He'd never done that before, always just stood at the register. And he put his water down and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've been coming here for 30 years trying to figure out what I saw. And what I saw, the thing I couldn't explain, was a man walking out of that motel carrying an armful of stuff. At 3 a.m. I'd stopped here overnight, I was in a cab sleeping, and I woke up and looked out and there was this man coming out of the motel with a cardboard box and he walked straight out to the field and he didn't come back. I sat there for an hour. He never came back out. I said, that was 1994. That's when Thomas buried it. Ray stared at me. I said, he was alive in 1994. He's the one you saw. Ray said, he's the one I saw. Something in his face changed. Not relief exactly. More like the feeling of a thing finally landing. Finally settling somewhere it had been suspended for a long time. He said, what does he want? I told him. He was quiet. Then he said, I'll help. We went out at 3:15 in the morning, Ray and I. I want to be clear about the logistics of this because the logistics are what made it feel real, what kept it from feeling like something I was imagining. We got 2 shovels from the maintenance shed. I had the key, it was on my ring. We went around the back of the motel. Room 10's light was on. Thomas was in the field, standing out in the dead grass about 30 yards from the motel, and this time there was enough light to see him clearly. Ray stopped walking when he saw him. I said, it's okay. Ray said very quietly, it's the same man. Thomas looked at Ray. Ray looked at Thomas. Thomas said, I remember you. You were in the lot that night. Ray said, I've been coming back every Thursday for 30 years. Thomas said, I know. A long quiet moment between them. I stayed out of it. Then Thomas walked us to the spot. It was marked. Barely, you'd never see it unless you were looking, by a specific pattern of stones, 3 of them in a line, moss-covered now, nearly hidden in the grass. He'd set them in 1994 and they'd stayed. Took us about 20 minutes to find the box and dig it out. Metal, the kind of military surplus ammunition box that seals tight. Heavy with papers. Thomas stood and watched us and didn't touch anything. He said he couldn't, that it didn't work that way, that he could only be present while we did it. When we had the box out, Ray asked where to put it. Thomas said the cab of Ray's truck. Ray said he drove a sedan, not a truck anymore. Thomas almost smiled. He said that was fine. I asked what was in the box with the logbooks. Thomas looked at me. He said, keys. I didn't understand. I said, keys to what? He said, not mine. I found them over the years, in this lot, in this field, along the highway. Keys that didn't have locks anymore. People leave things. He paused. I was keeping them in case someone came looking. He looked at the box in my hands. Nobody came, so I buried them here. I know what you want to know. What were the keys for? I don't know. We didn't open the box on the property. Thomas said not to, said to seal it back up and take it away. Ray put it in his car. He drove it to his home in Memphis and he has it in a closet there. He called me once and said he was going to research them, try to figure out where they'd come from. That was 2.5 years ago. I haven't heard from him since, and I don't have contact information for him that still works. What Thomas meant about not being the only one who'd buried things in the field, I don't know that either, and I chose not to ask further. Some roads I decided not to walk down. Whether I saw Thomas Reed again after that night, I did not. Room 10 has been dark since then. Every walkthrough, every shift. For the remaining 4 months I worked there. What happened in September when the construction began? I wasn't there. I'd left Trails End in August, left for reasons I'll get to in a moment. I've searched for news about the development, construction of a distribution warehouse on the back parcel, and I found nothing unusual. No reports of discoveries. No news. Maybe nothing was found. Maybe it's all still there, whatever else is in that field. Maybe Thomas cleared it somehow. Maybe it was only ever his box. Here is why I left in August. It had nothing to do with Thomas. I want to be clear about that. By the time summer came, I'd made a kind of peace with the situation. Thomas had what he needed. Room 10 stayed dark. The nights were quiet. Phil and I had reached an understanding, the kind where you've shared something strange and decided together not to poke at it. I left because of what I found in Brenda's office. I was covering the day shift one Thursday. Someone had called out sick, and I was in Brenda's office printing something when I knocked a folder off the shelf by accident. Papers scattered. I picked them up. They were personnel files. Incomplete ones, copies of copies, not official. Night shift workers going back to 2001. There were 14 of them in 22 years. 14 people who'd worked the overnight shift at Trail's End. Most with standard end dates, resigned, transferred, moved away. Normal turnover for a truck stop. But 3 of them, 3 in that stack, had a different notation. Not resigned or transferred. Just a word, handwritten in the margin in the same handwriting on all 3. Unaccounted. I stared at that word for a long time. I did not ask Brenda about it. Something told me. The same instinct that had turned me around in the parking lot the night I first found room 10 lit up. That asking Brenda was not the right move. That Brenda might know what unaccounted meant, and I was not sure I wanted her to tell me. I put the files back. I finished the shift. I gave my 2 weeks' notice the following Monday. I did not tell anyone why. 3 years later, I live in Nashville now. I have a day job, actual daytime hours, and I sleep at night, and I don't think about Trail's End every day anymore. Maybe twice a week, less some weeks. I think about Ray. I hope he's okay. I think about whatever he found in that box, if he found anything, and whether it answered anything for him or just raised more questions. I think about Thomas Reed, whether he's at rest or whether there's something else he's waiting for, some other task, some other night shift worker to do a walkthrough at 3 in the morning and find the light on in room 10. I think about the 3 names in Brenda's file, the ones marked unaccounted. I've looked them up as much as I can, public records, newspapers, social media. 2 of them I found no trace of, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. One of them I found a missing persons report from 2014, filed by a family member, never resolved. I think about what Thomas said about keys. Nobody came looking. People leave things. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes I think about what old Wendell said. The specific wording of it. Don't let anybody put you in room 10. Not don't go. Don't let anybody put you there. I've wondered, in the years since, whether Thomas was only ever benign. Whether the reason he could only watch, never touch, never move the box himself. Whether that limitation meant what it seemed to mean, or whether it meant something else entirely. Whether there was something else in that field, something that wasn't Thomas, that could touch things, that could move things, that could use a key. I'm telling you this now because I heard last month that Trail's End is closing. The motel is being sold separately. Gerald Lott died in the spring and his estate is liquidating the property. The truck stop itself is being absorbed by a chain, remodeled, rebranded. The whole complex will be unrecognizable within a year. Whatever is in that building, in that room, in those walls will be dispersed, redistributed. I don't know what that means practically. Maybe nothing. Maybe the things that accumulate in a place over 50 years of people passing through, leaving things, leaving pieces of themselves, maybe those things don't travel. Maybe they're rooted. Or maybe they go where people go. I don't know. What I know is that if you're driving I-40 through western Tennessee some night and you're tired and you see the sign for Trail's End at exit 212 or whatever they rename it, and you decide to pull off and get gas and a coffee and stretch your legs, the night shift worker behind the register has seen things you haven't. The motel out back has a room that knows when someone's coming. And somewhere in that field, or somewhere in the cab of a retired truck driver's sedan in Memphis, there is a metal box full of keys that were left behind by people who never came back for them. And maybe that's nothing. And maybe it isn't. Drive safe. Tip your night shift workers. And if someone ever asks you to go out to the field to help them with something, don't.